Hello there, I'm Black Bright News, and I wanted to talk about a phrase I heard earlier today. It was the age of Aquarius, which reminded me of the song by Fifth Dimension. I think it's a 1960s song. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. I know I've got a lousy voice, but my dad always used to say to me, "You couldn't sing to save your life." But anyway, for years I honestly thought it was just a 1960s song that nobody needed to understand. But apparently, there is rather more to it than that. And once I started looking into it, I realised that when people talk about the age of Aquarius today, they're not necessarily talking about a song, astrology, or a bunch of people sitting around waiting for the planets to do something. They're talking about change. They're talking about consciousness. They're talking about breaking patterns, questioning what we've been taught, and in some cases, what they describe as breaking curses and passing the torch. The astronomical part of it is real. The Earth actually has a very slow wobble. And over thousands of years, that changes the position of the equinox against the background stars. Astrologers divide that enormous cycle into what they call astrological ages, each lasting roughly 2,000 years. The age of Pisces is said to be giving way to the age of Aquarius, but exactly when that happens is disputed. There isn't a date stamped on the calendar saying, "Congratulations, everybody, the age of Aquarius starts today." So when people talk about the age of Aquarius, they're often talking about something much bigger than a date. They're talking about a shift in the way human beings think, and this is where it gets interesting. Aquarius is traditionally associated with things like freedom, innovation, equality, humanitarian thinking, technology, challenging authority, and looking at the collective rather than simply the individual. So you can understand why people have connected it with the changing world. Think about what we've witnessed in our own lifetimes. Information that used to be controlled by a relatively small number of institutions is now in everybody's hands. People can publish their own ideas, create their own media, challenge governments, challenge companies, challenge experts, organize movements, and speak to people on the other side of the world without asking anybody's permission. Now, that doesn't mean everything we see online is true. We know it isn't. But it does mean the old system of somebody important telling you what you need to know and you accept it has been seriously disrupted. And perhaps that's part of what people mean when they're talking about a higher level of consciousness. I'm not talking about becoming some sort of floating spiritual being who walks around permanently enlightened and never loses their temper in Tesco. I'm talking about becoming more aware of ourselves, more aware of our behavior, more aware of what we've inherited, more willing to ask, why do I believe this? And that brings me to the phrase I heard alongside the age of Aquarius, breaking curses. Now, some people mean that literally and spiritually, and that's their belief. But there is another way to understand it that I think most of us can recognize. Sometimes a curse is simply a pattern that has been passed down so long that everybody assumes it's normal. A family, say for example, where nobody talks about feelings, a family where women are expected to carry everybody, a family where the men don't express emotion, a family where everybody struggles financially but nobody talks about money, a family where addiction, violence, resentment, or emotional absence keeps appearing in one generation after the other. And then one person comes along and says, "Actually, I don't want this to continue." And those words can break the cycle, i.e., end the curse. You don't have to believe in anything mystical to understand the power of that. There is a there is this idea of undoing programming. All of us have been programmed to some extent. Before we were old enough to question anything, before people were ready, before we were old enough to question anything, people were already teaching us what was right, what was wrong, what was respectable, what was shameful, what success looked like, what failure looked like, what men should do, what women should do, who should we trust, who we shouldn't trust, what people like us could achieve, and what apparently was beyond our reach. Some of that teaching was valuable, some of it kept us safe, and some of it kept us still. Some of it helped us to become decent human beings, but some of it may have been somebody else's fear handed down to us as wisdom. And there comes a point when you have to examine the instructions you've been given around and ask, is this still relevant for me? Because something being familiar doesn't automatically make it true. That's where consciousness comes in. It's not about knowing everything. In fact, I think consciousness begins when we become comfortable enough to admit we don't know everything. Admit when we're wrong. Because once we can admit we're wrong, we can learn, change, listen, apologize, reflect, reconsider, and grow. Every generation receives a torch from the generation before. Some of us inherit achievements, wisdom, resilience, culture, music, language, traditions, and stories, while others inherit prejudice, trauma, fear, silence, bad habits, and unresolved pain. Our job is to look at what we've been handed and decide what we are going to carry forward and what we're going to leave behind. That's what generational change looks like to me. Because sometimes when you think about like today, because thoughts and beliefs have been handed down to the children and children's children, it keeps coming up year after year, generation after generation. So maybe your mother was told she couldn't do something and you did it. Maybe your father was never allowed to talk about his feelings and you learned to communicate. Maybe your grandmother survived by keeping quiet and you learned to speak out. Maybe somebody before you accepted a life they didn't want because they thought there was no alternative and you decided there was. That is breaking the curse. That is passing the torch in a different way. Some people will hear all of this and say, well, I'm not into astrology. And that's perfectly fine. You don't have to be. There is a difference between saying that the stars are causing human consciousness to change and saying that the age of Aquarius has become a useful symbol for a period of human questioning and transformation. The first is an astrological belief. The second is something we can observe and debate for ourselves. And perhaps that is why this idea has survived for so long, because beneath or underneath all the talk about planets, constellations, and cosmic cycles, there is a very human question. Are we willing to become more conscious than the people who came before us? Are we willing enough to be conscious enough to recognize patterns, conscious enough to question the programming, conscious enough to stop handing our pain to our children as though it was an heirloom, conscious enough to say this happened before, but it doesn't have to continue through me. And perhaps that is the part of the age of Aquarius that interests me most. Not whether somebody can tell me the exact year it began, not whether Jupiter is standing next to Mars, but whether we are actually learning to think for ourselves, to see each other differently, to challenge systems that no longer serve people, and to leave the next generation with a little less baggage than what we were given. And if that is what people mean by higher consciousness, then perhaps we don't need to wait for the planets to give us permission. Perhaps the dawning of any new age begins with ordinary people becoming conscious enough to say, I see it now, I understand it now, and I'm going to do something different. And maybe that is where real change begins. Because we keep carrying on, what our parents told us, we have to believe it. We don't have to believe it. We can prove it for ourselves. So have a thought about that. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of each other. And until the next time, this is Black Bright News, over and out. Bye bye.